Hello and welcome back. Now, where I left off, we were talking about the G factor of intelligence, right? What we're looking for here is some understanding of the concept of general intelligence that maybe will be separate from the topics of domain-specific skills, the S factors that Spearman had also studied as well. And so further understanding of G helps us as we move forward with theories of intelligence now. Um, we have GC and GF, right? So crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. So what we're going to look at here is something that sounds actually maybe a little familiar. So I have a couple of notes in there, taking this back to the problem solving chapter when we talked about the Gestalt approach, reproductive thinking, and productive thinking. So I think I probably said something when we covered that to make a note that we might revisit something like this. This is that. So crystallized intelligence here is defined as essentially all of the knowledge that we have acquired across our lifespan, right? So this is stuff that happens in education, but it happens just in every walk of life, right? We gain experience. We learn from our parents as we are growing up as children. We are educated in how the world works, the culture that we live in. And of course, we go to school and we learn a lot of that sort of stuff. And so essentially, what's happening here is that we are being taught to solve specific kinds of problems as a result of this education. And a lot of that, of course, is school related stuff. Excuse me. So that means we learn how to solve math problems, of course, right? That's just one example. But also in a cultural setting, we may learn to solve a whole variety of other kinds of problems as well. So that might mean that we learn how to solve maybe a conflict between ourselves and some other person, right? So a relationship problem. And so again, that's going to look different potentially from culture to culture, from family to family, but we are learning things that are related to that. So this is all represent this acquired knowledge that we have. We'll call that crystallized intelligence because it seems to just be sort of something that is a little more fixed, right? So the analogy here is to think of the atomic structure of a crystal and how the atomic bonds are organized in such rigid geometric patterns, right? It's all crystal clear, right? Fixed and unchanging. And that's the thing about solving familiar problems is that there are rules, right? We've talked about the algorithms and things that we apply to, say, arithmetic problems. So again, that's a fairly rigid, rule-based kind of system. And that's all part of crystallized intelligence here. Fluid intelligence is more about the adaptability, the flexibility of productive thinking, solving novel problems, right? So all of those things we've talked about with, say, functional fixedness, we've never been taught how to solve these problems. It's a completely novel thing. We've never been presented with such a problem before. So it requires creativity, right? And so that's how we want to kind of think of fluid intelligence here is that kind of creative problem solving where you can think outside the box and come up with novel solutions to problems. You're not just repeating things that you have learned how to do already in the past. You're inventing solutions, right? Now, I have a note here as well that when we think back to the Wechsler scales of intelligence, um, some of the subscales included things related to working memory and processing speed. So that's going to correlate with fluid intelligence, as it turns out. And this is going to be interesting in a couple of different perspectives. One thing that I'll just briefly mention, since it's not super critical for our immediate purposes, is these things change across the lifespan. We usually think of someone's intelligence and IQ as being pretty constant across the lifespan, and that's mostly true. But what happens here is that crystallized intelligence is something that can increase, right? We can continue to learn new things and acquire new skills as, you know, throughout the course of our lifespan. But this ability to think in more flexible and adaptive terms and deal with novelty and solve novel problems, fluid intelligence may decline a little bit across the lifespan. That might also correlate with some age-related changes in cognition that we know about, including declines in attention and working memory and processing speed. So worth keeping that kind of stuff in mind, although, like I said, we're not really getting much into any developmental questions in this course. Um, Now, what's the issue here with working memory? So we've treated working memory capacity before as a cognitive process here, and we may have a tendency to think, wait a minute, isn't that a separate construct, right? That's what we were talking about at the beginning of the intelligence notes is intelligence is a construct. So what's the construct we're trying to get at here? Is it problem solving ability? Isn't working memory a completely different construct? What about personality and that openness trait that I mentioned? Isn't that supposed to be a different construct? So again, we start to run into some real difficult challenges here when we start to try to find boundaries between these constructs, and we might really start to worry that is intelligence something that we've already talked about? Meaning that when we talk about the reasoning stuff and we talk about working memory and processing speed and divided attention and all these particular topics, that we've, through defining all of that stuff, we've actually already defined intelligence, right? So it's not its own separate construct. And that's kind of a concern that we have here. Now, does this hold water, right? Is it fair to say that we could explain away intelligence by just talking about working memory and processing speed and stuff like that? And the answer is, well, no, not totally, right? So what we can see here is that it makes some sense that working memory capacity might correlate with performance on an IQ test, because what's going on here is that this means that if you have better working memory capacity, this means you're going to be able to keep more information active in your working memory, and the more information you can keep active means the better you're able to use that information for a task that you're trying to do, and that might be a problem-solving task. So, of course, it makes sense that if I can hold more information, I can use it more effectively as applicable to solving whatever problem. So, just by reducing our overall cognitive load, by having better and more efficient ways of organizing and keeping memory information active in working memory, means we're going to do a lot better here, and our pattern recognition could also be better, and so on and so forth. We talked about the importance of that for expertise, and that's a critical thing as well, right? The chess players can see patterns on the chessboard as opposed to having to note the position of every single piece. And that means that not only do they have that pattern recognition, but by being able to chunk that information, they are reducing their cognitive load, and it gives them more working memory available to then anticipate and plan strategies and moves, to beat their opponent, right? So we would say that, okay, there is that correlation. It makes a little bit of sense here. Now, another question, though, is does this mean that if we're finding ways to improve our working memory, could this improve our performance on intelligence testing? And the answer is partially true, right? Have been some studies that, and this is the kind of stuff sometimes you see when you see some maybe less than perfectly ethical apps advertising themselves, some neuroscience brain training games and things like this. Now, there is a little bit of evidence that studies that are directly designed to target your working memory capacity can pay off when it comes to your performance on the subscales of the Wechsler test, right, that are related to the fluid intelligence. Now, the effects are not super strong, and it's not really suggesting that even your working memory capacity is something that can be improved quite dramatically. But certainly there is that relationship that's at least worth keeping in mind here. Now, another component of intelligence and a way of thinking about intelligence and defining it is a little related to some of the issues that I mentioned a bit ago about the cultural differences. So Sternberg has a particular view here. We have it's the triarchic theory, meaning there's three parts to it here. The first one, componential intelligence, is pretty similar to what we mean by crystallized intelligence. The second one, of experiential or creative intelligence, is pretty similar to what we're calling fluid intelligence. The third one, on the other hand, is one that Sternberg makes a bigger deal about, and it's very distinct from the other two as a result. The idea here is that Sternberg has spent a lot of his career traveling around the world and observing children from different cultures who grow up in very different environments than kids who grow up in, say, a Western industrialized environment where there are structured schools and educational experiences. And one of the things that he discovered very early on is that if you try to administer something like a Wechsler test to kids in those environments, they do very poorly on them. And of course, that could lead us to believe that maybe children from these particular areas have low levels of intelligence. But Sternberg doesn't believe that, and most reasonable people do not. Rather, what's happening here is that we're suggesting that performance on the intelligence tests that we have are very much a function of the educational environment that we live in. So the concern is kind of one thing I was getting at in the previous video, that someone could be intelligent but not educated, at least not in the traditional Western sense. And in a perfect world, an intelligence test would be able to identify such a person as being highly intelligent despite their lack of education. But we currently do not have a test that can actually do that, at least not very well. So Sternberg suggests here that what we're seeing here is we're seeing intelligence manifest in other ways besides the kind of educational academic settings that we normally think about it here, right? And of course, I mentioned in the previous video too that the traditional use of IQ testing is for predicting success in the standard Western classroom. So again, of course, then that means that in these other environments, that kind of IQ testing is not really going to help us understand the broader idea of intelligence. And that's where Sternberg wants to get into this contextual intelligence. The claim here is that growing up in a specific environment, you're learning problem-solving skills that are relevant to the environment that you live in. And those might not be the kinds of problems that you learn in a classroom, but rather it might be problems that relate to, it could be, of course, relationships and conflicts and things that I mentioned before, but also it could be things that are more about living in your immediate physical environment, the nature of the plants and the animals, and where food comes from and how you make food, and general survival issues like this. And those are real problems that require real intelligence to solve. And people in these environments are quite adapted at solving those problems. And that, of course, is an expression of human intelligence. And again, this relates back to that bigger question here. Intelligence is something we might need to think of as a construct here as something that occurs at the human level, right? To say that all of these behaviors are expressions of human intelligence means that at a species level, humans have evolved the capacity for reasoning and judgment and problem solving. That doesn't mean that individual differences in how we do any of these things actually represents any meaningful difference in intelligence here. We all have intelligence. We have different ways of doing things, perhaps, right? But to treat that into some sort of quantity, a measurable quantity, and to say that this person has more than this other person as a result of that, that's where things get potentially problematic, right? Okay, so that's Sternberg's contribution here. Now, if we're going to start naming other forms of intelligence, we might throw in Gardner here as well, famous for this long list of what are referred to here as his multiple intelligences. And so here things start to look a lot more domain specific and less like the G factor. So we've got linguistic skills and mathematical or logical skills, and even musical skills is treated as a form of intelligence here. Bodily and kinesthetic skills, meaning are you good with your hands, right? And good in athletics and so forth. And that's also treated as a form of intelligence. And spatial understanding and the interpersonal stuff, again, the conflict resolution and understanding other people, another form of intelligence, a social kind of intelligence. I'm also connecting it here to emotional intelligence. So hold the phone on that. We'll have the next slide here. And then there's even how well you know yourself, the intrapersonal form of intelligence. And then even that issue that I mentioned with contextual intelligence about our understanding of our natural environments and our ability to thrive and understand and function well and adapt to our natural environment. Gardner is considering that another form of intelligence here, the naturalist one. Let's talk about the emotional intelligence. So this ability to get along with others, right? One of the things that's interesting about this is that I mentioned using IQ to predict careers and success, and partly it can be useful there, but even more predictive is emotional intelligence. What we find is that people who score high in emotional intelligence, there's a term EQ that sometimes gets used here, but it's emotional quotient doesn't make a lot of sense really. Um, but Here we have the five components. All right. So how aware of you are yourself, self-awareness and self-regulation, emotional regulation, inhibiting yourself from saying inappropriate things, things like that. Motivation, right? This is maybe aligning to what we've called grit and conscientiousness before a little bit. Empathy and social skills, the last two being really the big, stronger part of the social side of things here. And the claim is that people who score high in these tend to be the ones who are really successful in their careers. And that's because they get along with their colleagues and their coworkers, and they have good relationships with everyone. This also then allows them to rise and get promoted because they are well liked and well respected and they are trusted by other people. And that also then makes them good leaders because when you are placed in charge of other people, those people are willing to trust that you know what you're doing and you know what you're talking about because you're really good at communicating. You're also really good at understanding every member of your team and what they do and what they're good at. So you make sure that you put them in positions to succeed. Everyone feels happy. People have conflicts in the workplace, but you really have a good ability to read that and understand it and engage in conflict resolution and so on and so forth. And so you can imagine this kind of stuff is very highly predictive of success in those kinds of situations here. Um, I also mentioned when we talked about academic success, how some of these traits could also be relevant to success there as well, right? It's not just pure traditional IQ, but the way that we fit in socially in the classroom and with our teachers can very much predict our success in this environment, how much we thrive in this environment. Now, I do have a note there in the middle of the screen that, again, we might find ourselves talking about things that are not necessarily intelligence, but these could just be other kinds of traits that are more personality and preference. And that might even apply to Gardner's multiple intelligences as well. Is it fair and is it correct to think of these things as a form of intelligence, or are we talking about some other kind of skill or tendency or just behavioral pattern of some sort, right? That could be called personality or something like it. Not clear. I'm not sure that it's necessary that we even worry about it, but these just could be relevant constructs that we need to uh, understand. Okay, so I want to stop it right there because I want to do, again, keep these videos at a reasonable length, but this whole next section deals with the development of cognitive ability in childhood. And as I said earlier, we're not going to have too much to say about development, but we do have a little bit to say about development here. So we're going to go ahead and stop it here, and we will then pick it up in the next video right here by talking about the work of Piaget and others.